My name is Bob Liff, and this is the CUNY Forum, a town meeting for students and faculty of the Edward T. Rogalski Internship Program in Government and Public Affairs. When Hurricane Ida roared through New York, leaving 11 dead in basement apartments and flooding streets and subways, there were echoes of the deadly devastation left by Superstorm Sandy 9 years ago, and one aching question: are these storms a harbinger of the impacts of a changing global climate? We learned a great deal from debates over acid rain in the 1970s, when it was clear that industrial pollutants released into the air in the Midwest was settling in northeastern states, much as any attempt to control coal-burning power plants in China and India has to reckon with the fact that those pollutants do not respect national boundaries. When this program airs, the world will be gathered in Glasgow, Scotland for the United Nations Climate Summit, where prospects for collective action to limit the rise in global temperatures will run up against economic realities that make it unlikely enough progress will be made to make us very hopeful. But the mantra of think globally, act locally is very much in the air here in New York, where past environmental actions, including changing the fuels in our cars and the types of oils that heat our polluting buildings, have left our air cleaner than it would have otherwise been. The urgency is even greater now to change the way we organize our economy and our city to prepare for an uncertain future, as the recent spate of 500-year storms coming twice a decade has shown. Replacing fossil fuels with renewable wind and solar energy, or increased hydrogen power, or even the return of carbon-neutral nuclear plants are all on the table. Work has begun on seawalls and protective structures for low-lying areas in Lower Manhattan, while the city commits, tragically too late for the 11 victims of Ida, to find ways to protect thousands of New Yorkers, predominantly poor and of color, who live in those basement apartments, many of them illegal under city zoning codes. Governor Hochul has unveiled a multi-billion-dollar plan to make green investments in infrastructure around the state to help us withstand the next storm. The Regional Plan Association has come out with a far-reaching report calling for reimagining our streets, removing parking, and continuing to try and force us out of our cars and back on the subways as we recover from the economic and health crises fomented by the COVID pandemic. Soon-to-be Mayor Adams has rolled out a plan to build climate resiliency into all land use decisions, including incentivizing developers to include rainwater storage and rooftop gardens to cool buildings and absorb rain. And he promises to ditch his SUV whenever he can and ride a bike around New York. I think that's enough for one show. We're joined by 4 New Yorkers who take part in and observe how we plan for a livable and sustainable future for the city we call home. William Selecki is professor in Hunter College's Department of Geography and Environmental Science and was the founding director of the CUNY Institute for Sustainable Cities. State Senator Andrew Bernardus represents Southern Brooklyn's 22nd District, a swath of waterfront neighborhoods where storm-related threats of flooding and the like are a recurring presence. Cliff Hagan is the president of the Staten Island's Protector of Pine Oak Woods, the island's largest conservation organization, and is a middle school science teacher as well. And Samantha Maldonado is a reporter at thecity.nyc who has been covering climate resilience in the city, who will tell us what it all means. And pardon a bit of free advertising, if you don't read thecity.nyc, you should. Professor Selecki, Bill, let me start with you. As I mentioned in the opening, the Climate Summit in Glasgow is underway as the show airs. You've looked at resiliency in urban areas in New York and New Jersey regionally, and much of the developing world continues to burn coal. Can cities make a difference in tackling climate change?
Yes, great. Thanks for inviting me to this discussion, Bob. Yeah, cities have over the last 10 years really been heralded as kind of the leading edge with respect to climate action, both in terms of adaptation and also mitigation. I mean, the standard line, of course, is that the issues that we see as impacting places from climate change, they impact cities. They're very directly observed. We heard about your intro about Hurricane Ida. So cities have really, globally have experienced these sorts of events, and really you've seen mayors, others, representatives coming forward, along with community groups, really recognizing the change that they're seeing and the demand for action. So they have been pushed forward as these sort of heroes. That being said, the Glasgow process focuses mostly on nation states and the action of nation states. And in terms of Glasgow terminology, the subnational entities, such as cities, are trying to play a larger and larger role there.
Cliff, Staten Island took the brunt of Hurricane Sandy, remains exposed to the ravages of storms. And, and you've been trying to protect Pine Oak Woods, and I think also Granville wetlands you've been involved with. Is climate change a factor in what you're doing? I mean, is that driving some of the thinking around it?
The organization for more than 45 years has been involved with the preservation of open space, right? And that now is a growing concern, is a growing motivation for what the organization does. Sure, at first it wasn't, it was just about preservation of open space. But as the island has grown more urban, we recognize that open space is, it's a watershed, it's a corridor rather than storm sewers, rather than the hard infrastructure. We have natural space that acts as infrastructure for us already. So yes, climate change is part of the motivation now for the preservation of open space on the island.
Senator, Andrew, after Sandy, there were promises to build back better. And 9 years later, I think it's fair to say progress has been slow on the mitigation factors that were promised. Your constituents are on the front lines of these threats. What's been going on?
Well, you're absolutely right, Bob. The district that I represent in southern Brooklyn, half of it got wiped out during Sandy. And still, 9 years later, neighborhoods, people who live in neighborhoods like Sheepshead Bay, Manhattan Beach, Gerritsen Beach, even parts of like Southern Marine Park, are still trying to fight with the city in order to get back into their homes. It's still a struggle 9 years later. We're fighting the bureaucracy, we're fighting with contractors, we're fighting with the federal government, we're fighting with the city. We still have not done enough to get these people back into their homes, nor have we done enough to be proactive about preparing for the next storm, the next issue. I think it was like 2 years ago, the city comptroller put out a study saying that only 54% of federal funds that were earmarked for repairs and resiliency measures for the entire city had actually gone towards that effort. And that is just a shockingly low number. We should have learned our lesson from a decade ago, but clearly we haven't. And what makes it even more frustrating for my constituents is we see that sometimes the city comes out with these big, bold plans for Lower Manhattan. The mayor announced a $1 billion initiative to protect Lower Manhattan, which, good for them. But what does that say to us when people still can't get back into their homes from 10 years ago because we never focused on the really vulnerable, low-lying coastal communities in our outer boroughs? So we feel left out of the conversation. We feel ignored by the powers that be, and we're getting really frustrated. And I think that this frustration is only, magnified by what we saw happen most recently with Ida and the flooding that happened. And it really points to a lack of infrastructure investments in a lot of our outer borough communities, whether they are coastal defenses, whether they are flooding protections, or whether there's something as simple as like, we're going to replace catch basins and backwater valves and, sewage pipes in communities that have been dealing with the same infrastructure for more than 100 years. So the short answer to your question is clearly we've not done enough, and neighborhoods like mine are tired of waiting.
Samantha, I believe you wrote this story out of Queens, but the kind of Build Back Better stuff that Senator Gennardis is talking about, they use that phrase. I mean, if I remember, you were interviewing the borough president of Queens, Donovan Richards, and I almost read you as a journalistic cringe about hearing the same term when you have all this frustration that Andrew is reflecting. Does that? People need to rebuild. People need to continue to live in Queens. What's your reaction to what the senator was just saying?
Yeah, well, when I talked to Queens Borough President Richard Donovan, he did say, this is not something I want necessarily. He said, we've heard about all of the bureaucratic mishaps with Build Back Better, and some people haven't even, gotten to their homes that were promised to them almost a decade ago. But he also said, given the tragedies that happened with Ida and people are still not in their homes, almost 2 months later, and they're also not getting the FEMA aid that they were told that they would get, or it's slow coming. Richard Donovan really wants the city to step up and help out and help rebuild. I think he's just asking for any help that could be had from the city or, from other entities, but obviously he can only really ask the city. So there's a lot of caveats there, but I also think, there's a wider conversation going on about retreating from areas that are prone to flood, and it's a really politically thorny topic, but people really are thinking about, what would it mean if I left my home and went somewhere else if it, floods all the time, either from storms or from sea level rise or from heavy rains. So that's something the city is looking more into. After Sandy, there were some limited programs for buyouts, for example, especially in Staten Island, but now they're looking to expand on that.
Well, in Staten Island, if I remember, Cliff, there was an area down in the southern tip of Staten Island where the city basically bought those homes and let that area return to wetlands. Am I remembering that correctly?
It's not the southern tip, Tottenville. It's more the center of the island, Oakwood Beach, Fox Beach. They spent $122 million buying 300 properties, 299 properties for $122 million. And those properties now are vacant. It's open space, yes.
Samantha, I just want to touch one other story you recently done, just to give a sense of the real world implications of all of this. You also wrote a story about these huge increases in homeowners insurance in flood zones. I will say, after Hurricane Sandy, we got a notification that we were in a flood zone in our apartment, and we live in Morningside Heights, which is 70 feet above the river. So either somebody had a bad map or New York was gone. If we were flooding, New York was gone. We were, so I mean, there are imperfections in Washington doing these maps, but people face huge bills and no way to pay them. Samantha, I mean.
Right. So, yeah. So about the maps right now that show where flood areas are outdated, and FEMA is working on new ones, and they're working on them in collaboration with the city of New York. And those will take into account mostly sea level rise and a little bit of river flooding, but not the kind of flooding that we saw during Ida that was inland and from overtaxed drainage systems. But there are increases and some decreases for people for their flood insurance bills. We don't exactly know who is getting hit with increases and decreases, but our analysis at the city showed that about 60% of homeowners who have flood insurance will get increases starting in April. Some will get decreases also. And I think the change from what FEMA says is that it's supposed to take into account the value of property, because some people who had lower valued property were actually paying more for insurance relative to those who had, mansions on the beach that were not paying their fair share. But we really need to see how it plays out come April.
I assume, Andrew, this is a pretty big issue, and I assume a lot of your constituents are getting hit with these bills and the threats of the higher bills.
Yeah, we certainly hear from constituents on that, and I think to Samantha's point, it's part of a much larger conversation that I don't know if we're ready to have yet about what the future of coastal living really looks like and what it costs to live in these coastal communities, and what types of protections we need to be putting in place to help minimize and mitigate a lot of these additional costs that these communities, some of which have been there for hundreds of years, 100+ years rather. And what that would mean in terms of what it would take to protect them. So we certainly hear a lot from constituents, and we are all very eager to see what those new maps that the federal government is working on with FEMA and the city. We've seen some drafts. We're really eager to see those final maps put out, so then we can start having these conversations that are so necessary.
Bill, I was going to call him mayor-elect. He is not mayor-elect. Borough President Adams, who is the Democratic nominee for mayor, has been talking about things like building this resiliency into all land use decisions, green roofs, all of which would presumably provide a significant number of green jobs, which is a core selling point, if you will, by President Biden and by Governor Hochul. And you're talking about, Andrew was talking about catch basins and revamping our sewer system. These are not cheap things. Are these the kinds of resiliency measures cities have to take?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, typically what one would say is that you want to have a variety of approaches, right? So some are going to be soft infrastructure, which could involve like policies or other sorts of initiatives, even sort of wetlands to attenuate or block some of the wave action on coastal storms, and then of course hard infrastructure as well. So I think what you're going to look at is a variety of solutions. It's going to partly it's going to be a sort of a reimagining of what cities can look like, and an introduction of a variety of these alternatives such as green roofs and things that you mentioned that not only will provide opportunities for jobs, but also other amenity values in terms of passive recreation space or habitat for animals, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of co-benefits that people are looking at. I think it's also going to force a kind of a reimagining of how we've developed the city and the places that we've developed. I mean, we recognize that much of the coastlines of cities like the city of New York have been constructed through fill and sort of, development on top of old wetlands. Unfortunately, these are the places that we're now seeing to be most frequently flooded, not just from extreme events, but also, sunny day flooding, which we're already starting to see in Jamaica Bay, where mean monthly high tide flooding. So it's going to be sort of an integrated approach, different, soft, hard technology or infrastructure, as well as sort of understanding, capacities for living in places that are going to be highly vulnerable, whatever scenario you paint in the future.
The seawall issues are very complicated. The seawall that's proposed and apparently is about to start in lower Manhattan, which drew some protests from neighborhood residents fearing it would feed gentrification. All issues come back to housing. All issues come, all these issues are obviously integrated. Staten Island has been waiting for a seawall, especially after Hurricane Sandy. Are seawalls a long-term solution, or are they an interim solution? I mean, I don't know, Cliff or Bill. I mean, go ahead.
So, yes, they are waiting. It takes the Staten Island seawall is a federal issue, a state issue, and a city issue. To get those three municipalities together, those three governments together on the same page is a task in itself. And here we are years later, it still has not begun. That hard infrastructure, as Bill was suggesting, there is some need for hard infrastructure, but what's probably more effective is the preservation of open space. Here on the island, we have a blue belt system. The blue belt system is open space, natural watercourse, natural stream beds that allow for the stormwater to shed off the island. I know in Manhattan, Brooklyn, you don't necessarily have open space like that remaining, but here on the island, along with the seawall, we have the preservation of open space. And getting back to the borough president, Brooklyn Borough President Adams, his plan that he released does not mention preservation at all. And the deeper you go, the less preservation. There's no thought of preserving open space in that plan. That's unfortunate. That's a missed opportunity.
Bill, what about the idea of seawalls? I mean, they've even talked about, which I think some in other countries, they have these giant gates that close off to kind of keep a surge coming in from the ocean. It seems kind of, are these Band-Aids? Are they just buying time?
Well, I think the example you're thinking maybe is Rotterdam, and the Netherlands plans for the 1 in 10,000 year event, or the 10,000 year event, because much of the country is below sea level. You have the Thames River. Similarly, there's also up in Connecticut, from the '38 hurricane, they built some of these barriers as well.
But aren't they also talking about literally for New York Bay? Isn't
correct?
Discussion?
Yeah, there's various proposals that have been put forward, or at least sort of looked at. The Army Corps of Engineers sort of moved forward a plan. The past federal administration, at some point last year, sort of pulled the plug on that, so to speak. And I think the quote was to sort of give buckets and mops was the policy response at that point. But I think from the scientific community and the engineering community, all options have to be on the table. We need to look at all things, need to be studied. We haven't really done the full impact assessment. And of course, there are a number of these, besides the ecological impacts of sort of changing water currents around the island, we still don't really have a good understanding of how these barriers, if you did have, like, let's say something from Breezy Point to Sandy Hook in New Jersey, or similar things like that, how that would change the geometry, the flow patterns in a large storm event. Where would that water go? It's got to go somewhere. So you get into equity issues as well. But the bottom line is we need to look at all these options, and they have to be on the table.
Andrew, that kind of a project, or the seawalls, the president's been talking about green jobs. The governor's been talking about green jobs. You're a Democratic senator. How relevant is that in this debate?
I mean, that's really everything here, I think, frankly. Whether we're talking about federal infrastructure, green infrastructure, or even at the state level, the governor's made some very, I think, big announcements, or teased out some big announcements about trying to do some really big green job infrastructure projects in the years ahead. That's everything. The only way we're going to do the type of work that we need to do is to build the mitigating, technologies and systems and protections. That's going to all create work opportunities for people. And so it absolutely makes sense from an economics perspective and from an environmental perspective, and from a community preservation perspective, frankly, to kind of get everyone in alignment and say, look, here's how we're going to protect our communities, and we're going to do it, and we need your help. We need to put you to work in order to help protect our communities. It really is a no-brainer. We are very eager to see what comes out of Washington, D.C. I've been following these negotiations as best as possible. I think that what we're seeing so far, I think by some estimates, that I've heard of, New York's infrastructure budget could increase by like 25 or 30% with some of the federal funds flowing our way. That's tremendous. And that creates a real opportunity to invest in people and also invest in these neighborhoods.
Let me just throw out the energy issue. I mean, we're talking about renewable, about shifting away from fossil fuels to renewable energy. The RPA plan to kind of take cars off the streets, presumably that would include an element of shifting towards electric vehicles, which would require the creation of an electrical infrastructure for those cars to be powered, which we do not have now. I don't know who wants to tackle this, but Governor Cuomo, if you remember him, he used to be governor, moved to close down Indian Point nuclear power plant, which was non-carbon generating power system. Is that, and it's extremely controversial to have a nuclear power plant. Is that part of an energy future for the city? I don't know who wants to jump at that. I mean, you're the elected official, Senator. Let me jump on you about that, right?
Well, look, I think, my perspective is I think everything should be on the table, right? We have to think about every single possibility. We're not going to be able to, as best as from everything I've seen, we're not going to be able to provide for our entire energy future just based on the power of the sun, realistically, right? Or just based on the power of the wind, right? Right, like, or the wind. Like, we have to think about a multi strategy approach to really help us meet our goals and exceed our goals. And it's one thing to say that we can produce enough energy from renewable sources to meet our demand today, but what I think is missing from that conversation is that as we are shifting, and as we are building out this new infrastructure, new electric vehicle charging stations, and all these things, new battery capacity, production plants, and you name it, that's going to require another additional, creation of additional energy on top of what we currently have. And that also has to be done and made renewable. So we really have to think about expanding the total energy output that we have here. And we have to put every option on the table to help us meet those needs. So I certainly don't rule anything out. I know that some folks have concerns about nuclear energy. I know that other folks don't. I'm not as concerned about nuclear energy. I think the case with Indian Point is that it was just a very old facility as well. And really, we were not able to make the types of investments in it to keep it going. But certainly, from my perspective, to help us meet these needs for the next 25, 50, 100 years, we have to put every option on the table.
Samantha, one of the points that in the mayoral debates that Adams made is that, while we're talking about waterfront neighborhoods, about southern Brooklyn, about parts of Staten Island. The flooding that happened in Queens was from rain. It was not, and some of the flooding that happened in Staten Island was from the rain. It was not a waterfront issue. And that changes. De Blasio has said he's not going to be able to complete a survey, that the city will not be able to complete a survey of how many of these basement apartments, even if they're illegal under current city's zoning, there are. How does that factor in? Is that, do we spend too much time talking about seawalls and not enough time about talking this affects inland neighborhoods too?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're getting at a lot of the big thorny topics here with housing and with different kinds of climate risks. And all kinds of climate risks are what the city has to take into account when they're trying to protect the residents, whether they live on the coast and will be experiencing floods from sea level rise, or whether they live in, essentially basins, like really low-lying areas in Queens or Staten Island or Brooklyn that just fill up when it rains. And there's different fixes, or at least tools that we can use to help mitigate all of those effects. So whether they're seawalls, whether it's bioswales and rain gardens to help collect that water, they all do make a difference. But I think to your point on basement apartments, yeah, I mean, it is concerning that the administration won't be finishing the survey of basement apartments before the de Blasio administration is gone. But basement apartments are also not going to be, based on my reporting, they're not going to be safe, even if they're legalized. If floods happen, they will still fill up because they are in the basement. So I think there's sort of a broader question about housing availability and affordability that we need to be talking about.
Cliff, I don't want to, because you teach middle school and you teach science in middle school, I'm interested, I assume that climate resiliency, the future of the climate, is part of a science curriculum that you're talking to the students about. Are they conscious of this? Are they, middle school students don't always have the most long-term view, but what happens in the classroom about this?
Yeah, these children do live in the country, don't they? But certainly the whole notion of climate change and the impact of climate on our lives, that's part of their culture now. It's part of their conversation. It's not something new. Like when I was a child, nobody spoke of these things. So they do understand. The schools provide community service for the kids. In order to join National Honor Society, you have to have community service. They're no longer going to nursing homes. They're going to parks. They're doing cleanups in parks. They're doing cleanup in beaches, and they're comfortable with that. It's part of what children are. It's part of their awareness now. It's part of who they are.
Does that, obviously, Bill, you set up an Urban Resiliency Institute at Hunter, if I'm not mistaken. Is that correct?
Right.
How has that changed over the years? Has that become, obvious? Part of this is an obvious question. As we've moved and the problem has become more and more clear, even if it's not very clear when you look at Glasgow, is there heightened interest? Is there fear? Is there hope? Is there what?
Yeah, it's a great question. And echoing what Cliff just mentioned, I think, these college students, there's apprehension, there's concern for the future, there's sort of like frustration, I have kids, my daughter's 24, so a little older than college, but, she comes to me every now and then, wanting to know more about climate change. And I think the thing is that they want capacity to engage, they want action. And I think, the good side is I think that they're engaging more and more in the process, in the political process. We've seen the power of youth movements, everything, throughout the world, really leading the way in many cases, really being a catalyzing agent for change. And I think, the more and more that we are able to do that, and through work like Cliff does and others, I think is really the opportunity for the future. The other kind of thread into that is I think they also see it, and increasingly in the literature as well, as an opportunity not just to focus on climate, but other issues within society. So issues of equity, they see it very clearly with respect to climate impacts. Some people get impacted more than others. Even economic development, we've been talking about that today. So I think the good part of the story over the last 10 years is that the youth are engaged more and more, and they're recognizing there's opportunities to sort of address or, and engage with other social ills, other environmental ills that we're seeing in society.
These are, but this is not a zero-sum game. If you look at what's going on in Washington in the debating over the Biden rebuilding plan, and you think about Senator Manchin from West Virginia, who appears to be protecting coal and fossil fuel industries because of the economic cost it will have presumably on the people in his state, even though there's a lot fewer jobs in those industries right now because they're so mechanized and automated. Somebody's ox is getting bored in this. I mean, this kinds of Andrew, let me ask you this. I mean, somebody's going to lose. And, Bill, you've raised the equity questions. It's not the people at the top who are going to be suffering. It's a lot of working class, lower middle class people who have jobs in areas that are going to be done away with. I mean, Andrew, are people dealing with these trade-offs, or is it just an inevitability and to shut up and take it?
No, I don't know. I think Bill wanted to jump in a second. Bill, I don't know if I want to finish the thought.
Well, I totally agree. The equity issue cuts both ways. I mean, in terms of people who are going to be negatively affected in terms of, impacts and even adaptation, gentrification is a real concern, but also the job question, like the elimination, the diminution of jobs in the coal industry, other industries is a clear and pressing concern, not just in the U.S., but globally.
Yeah, I think, like I said earlier, there's an opportunity here, and I think part of the problem is that oftentimes our loftiest ambitions fall short when we talk about them. Think about, we keep talking about how we're going to help transition workers from the 19th century economy to a 21st century economy. Well, if all you've known all your life, I'm going to simplified example, if all you've known all your life is how to mine coal from a coal mine, right? And then someone comes along with these great promises, they're going to teach you how to build wind turbines, but they don't actually come through with it in a way that actually provides you the type of career stability and financial stability and professional stability that you always enjoy because that's all you've ever known. Why would you believe them? Why would you trust them? I think we always talk about worker retraining and new education, and we're going to prepare you for the jobs of the future. But what that actually looks like for a lot of people doesn't always match the rhetoric. And I think we should do a better job of just making sure that the rhetoric matches the reality and that we actually do follow through on those commitments, because there is a way to grow this pie for everybody. There is a way to tell people that we're going to transition you to better jobs, cleaner jobs, healthier jobs. And we are actually we promise you that, and we're going to follow through on that promise. And that helps, I think, take away a lot of the political imperatives that in the case of Senator Joe Manchin from West Virginia, where there is this still very 19th century idea about the importance of the coal mines. We have to protect the coal industry, even though that's a pathway to a dead end. We have to just do better in government and outside of government of making sure that we honor those promises. And I think we can do that. And this is a great opportunity to prove that.
And I do want to jump in here. And I think, there's examples in lots of places besides New York City that show the transition in transitioning co-workers to different kinds of greener jobs, or at least putting together sort of individualized career paths for them about what comes next. Their coal plants are closing. And on the issue of coal, I think it's important to note that Manchin is becoming personally wealthy through coal plants as well. So I think that's part of where he's is on the issue. But I also think when we talk about who gets these green jobs, it's important to note that some people are being brought into the fold, having been disenfranchised for so many years. And when I think about offshore wind, for example, I think of the work that community groups in South Brooklyn, like Uprose, has been doing to make sure that some people from their community, which is often low income, a lot of people of color, do get those jobs and are trained for the jobs, and that will bring wealth to their communities, hopefully, and also just get them involved in the green transition.
To beat a metaphor to death, the way the rubber meets the road, a lot of discussion on how the city responds to climate resiliency has to do with how we move around the city. Staten Island is very car dependent. Southern Brooklyn is pretty car dependent. we're looking at congestion pricing coming in. We're looking at the RPA report trying to say, get out of your cars, get back on the subways. Cliff, I guess I could start with you. I mean, you must run up against people who fear that, these crazy environmentalists are trying to take away your car.
Sure, particularly on the South Shore of Staten Island. You would think you were in a different city on the South Shore of Staten Island, so far removed from Manhattan. But many of those people do commute into Manhattan daily on buses, on trains, and a number of people drive into Manhattan or into Brooklyn. So yes, that is a bone of contention here on Staten Island. The notion that we have to pay to drive in to Manhattan. Really frowned upon. Very much frowned upon, because we are beholden to our cars, as you said.
Yeah.
Right? It's part of the culture here.
Go ahead, Samantha.
Oh, sure. I was going to say across the city, though, the majority of New Yorkers don't own cars. More people, take the subway and take buses than they own cars. And generally speaking, the people that do are, wealthier than those who don't. Of course, it's a concern, especially for accessibility and just lifestyle that can't be understated. But given that one of I think it's the second largest source of greenhouse gases are emitted from the transportation sector in New York City. It's sort of an existential question about can we lower those, and how is through making sure buses and subways are a more viable option, and how do you get people to use those? You make service be really good. Can you get more people biking, and how do you do that? You make it safer. And we've had the deadliest year for pedestrians and bikers since de Blasio took office, which I think is a huge concern, and really speaks to, it really puts his goals in question in terms of, how can we, his and the states, in terms of how can we reduce emissions from the transportation sector.
And I should throw in there as well the fast ferry. Our borough president has championed the fast ferry since he's entered office. He's finally seen one from St. George into Manhattan. But the South Shore of Staten Island is in desperate need of a fast ferry.
Let me go to Ernesto. Ernesto, you have questions from the students.
Our first question today comes from Kimberly Rios, who is actually the CUNY Cultural Core Program Coordinator here at CUNY. How can students who want a career in the cultural arts sector address environmental sustainability? Are there any career opportunities that merge the two fields of interest?
That's an interesting question. The cultural industry in New York City is a mammoth industry. It is, the number of jobs, as we've seen during the pandemic, when Broadway closed down, when a lot of the cultural activities closed down, it was a huge hit. It impacted hotels. It obviously impacted direct work. Andrew, I don't know if you have an idea of how, our cultural industry, which is so important to the city and the state and the nation, how does it factor in besides portraying the issue in the actual artistic works?
That is a great question. I probably don't have the best answer for it, but I think.
But I get to ask.
Yeah, I know you do. You're. But I think aside from portraying and documenting these stories, which I think plays a very, very important role. We can talk about documenting the stories through the press, which I know is a lot of the work that Samantha works on, but also through different cultural media as a way of telling the stories of climate change and the impacts of climate change on communities and on people and on society. Certainly, there's a role to play there, and that helps change the narrative and changes the conversation. But even things like looking at the footprints, the carbon footprints of our cultural institutions, what it takes, and this is probably on a small scale in the grand scheme of things, but what does it take to properly run the Metropolitan Museum? How much energy does it take to keep the lights on and the special chambers and the air pressure and I have no idea, but I'm sure it's a lot, and I'm sure it's more than it takes to run a household, right, or a large building. And these are buildings that are very old, very large, not built with the 21st century standards that new construction is built with today. And there is certainly a way that we can advance this conversation in big and small through these cultural institutions.
Yeah,
I gave
also
it my best
there's
shot there.
I was gonna say, yeah, it's sort of to go with what the senator said as well. I think there's a lot of opportunities from what I've seen for sustainability workers when it comes to film and museums and things like that. You know, when I think about film sets, I see a lot of, I'll walk by them in my neighborhood and I'll see a lot of trash thrown out or big trucks run with generators. And I'm sure there are consultants out there and you know, it's probably possible to do one that show more sustainable ways of having sets or you know, doing things that are greener and not just the same old ways.
Let me ask you, Bill, about, I assume you're looking at what's going on in Glasgow. I have, you know, it seems to me that because of the economic demands in places like India and places like China, which, you know, are more than 1 billion people in each nation with massive needs, would still burn a disproportionate amount of coal in particular. Can we control the temperature rise absent some significant cutbacks there? That's a nice small question.
I mean, I was actually on the 1.5 report, which basically said that we need to keep our warming 2 degrees C or below 2 degrees C toward 1.5 degrees C. And, you know, right now, I mean,
How much the temperature rise, you mean, right?
Yeah, how much temperature rise? So this is Celsius, so it translates to about 3.5 plus Fahrenheit increase, annual temperature. And that sounds like a little, but actually, it's actually a very significant amount. And there's clear evidence that if you go above 2 degrees C, you start to, you know, really get some, you know, significant alterations. We're about 1.1 degree Celsius right now. Now, to specifically your question, the IPCC, this intergovernmental panel, came out with a report earlier this year. Basically, we're steaming like way past 2 degrees C right now, you know, we more likely than not, you know, unless we make some, you know, right angle changes, we're going to steam past it probably in the next decade, and so the situation becomes that much more dire. But that being said, you know, there is a lot of, you know, international momentum to sort of address the issue. We'll see what comes out of Glasgow, which is sort of a kind of a stock take from a meeting 5 years ago. I think the crucial thing is what are countries committing to, and then what are they actually translating into action? And then the kind of sidelight to that is, are they putting money, you know, cash on the barrelhead to help countries make this transition, particularly the global north, helping the global south, which really, as you said, excluding China for a moment, but, you know, the global south, you know, does not have the cash and resources, especially with COVID, to address these issues. So we're in very tricky waters in terms of, you know, meeting our climate goals. And unless we move very aggressively, we're not going to do it. And I think one last thing, if I could just quickly tie in here, it's not just those two countries. I mean, if you look at sub-Saharan Africa, places like this who are rapidly aspiring for development, they have resources, they have, you know, petroleum, they want to develop it. They, you know, they basically are entering into a space where they see it's their time to develop, and the notion that they won't have their opportunity where the global north had, it becomes this huge global equity concern that is also being, you know, part of the understory of what will happen next month in Glasgow.
Well, those equity questions are real. And
Correct.
let me go to Ernesto. Ernesto, do you have a second question there?
Our second question comes from Megan Nylon, a graduate student at the CUNY School of Public Health and Health Policy. She is also a CUNY Women's Public Service intern at the Office of Assemblymember Seawright. Why is it taking so long for the federal funds to be used for Sandy-related repairs and reinforcements? Who is responsible for overseeing the allocation of these funds? New York City or FEMA?
Talk about the rubber meeting the road. Samantha and Andrew, I guess, you know, those go to you.
Senator, you want to take a crack at it? You're in the thick of the fight.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think the answer is kind of a little bit of both. You know, FEMA sends the money to the city, and city runs the program. And the way that the Build It Back program was set up was that, you know, they were kind of the primary vehicle for these funds to get distributed into communities. And like with many, not all, but with many of our city-run initiatives that we see kind of trying to, with the intention of doing good, it just fell into the victim of its own bureaucratic, mess. And, who becomes responsible for what, slow ups between FEMA and the city, miscommunications between the city and the constituents, FEMA then coming in on the back end saying, no, we didn't want this, we wanted that, you can't do this, you can't do that. And just, it's been a big holy mess. And everyone wants to point the finger at everyone else. But I think ultimately, from everything I've seen, all the constituent work that we've done to try to untangle some of these issues, we really see a lot of these issues fall into the lap of the city at this point. And it's very, very frustrating. At the end of the day, people don't care who's at fault. They just want their homes back. And they just want it resolved, regardless of where the responsibility lies. And that's what we're trying to drive home in our conversations with both the city agencies and with FEMA about trying to resolve these last lingering cases.
I was struck by Governor Hochul. This is off point, but for instance, the campaign for fiscal equity, the schools issue, which has been going on for literally decades, she just said, let's settle it. She's very practical. She's a very practical woman, and could do something similar with trying to break, she seems to be dedicated to breaking precisely the kinds of log jams that you're talking about, Andrew. Cliff, you made the point earlier that preservation does not seem to be part of preservation of wetlands, serving as a sponge for for the rain that's going to come, is not part of Eric Adams' proposal. Eric Adams is proposing a very aggressive economic expansion, building. He wants to develop business. He wants to develop housing. What would you tell him? What would you want him to say? What would you want him to think about?
Terrific. I appreciate that. I welcome, I invite Eric Adams to Staten Island. I'd like to take a walk through the Blue Belts with him and show him the nature of the preservation of open space and how efficient Mother Nature is. Much more efficient than any engineer can gather. The Blue Belt system on the island, it's necessary, it's successful, it's done very well, and it saved the city millions, tens of millions of dollars because it's already built. It's built through thousands of years of ecology, right? And Eric Adams needs to see that.
Samantha, I don't know if you've been covering the Adams endless transition. We've never had an 8-month transition, with all due respect to the Republican nominee for mayor. How high on his agenda? You're talking to people who are going to be pressing him on the issue of climate resiliency, how we respond, how we get from today to an uncertain tomorrow. Is it high on his agenda?
It meaning the climate?
Right. I mean, the impacts of climate and how you respond to it. He did talk in his land use plans about building resiliency into all kind of presumably high-rise development with green roofs, and he did talk about using green space to suck up some of the water that would otherwise be flooding streets and overloading sewers and stuff like that. But I don't know. I don't have the answer to this one.
Right. So, I mean, obviously his marquee campaign issue is public safety, and
Right.
I think climate has definitely fallen behind that, and maybe even like economic recovery as well. But he has released a climate plan, and I think some advocates are more hopeful than others about his understanding and willingness to really tackle these issues. There's some proposals that have come straight from advocacy books, really, and there's others that sort of show not as deep engagement with certain issues. But I mean, for example, he's really pushing for a 5-borough climate adaptation plan, which now the city is mandated by law to do. And he has been floating, programs for buyouts and things like that. But we'll see. It also really depends on who he appoints in some of these top cabinet positions.
Well, one of the things that encourages me is I think that Adams has really thought about the city. He talks about upstream issues and downstream issues, that you have crime on the street, which you have to deal with directly, but you have that crime because you have upstream issues. He talks about health issues, about diabetes, health impacts that disproportionately affect poor communities. And the upstream issue is you don't have fresh produce. He thinks about issues kind of holistically. And that kind of actually gives me hope for him. Samantha, you mentioned Uprose and Elizabeth Yeampierre and the work that's done in Sunset Park. You have a lot of community activists, Andrew, in your community. How important is at this hyper local level what people can be doing?
You know, I think I'm always a believer of active community groups. You know, my prior to my political, getting involved in politics, I came from a community background. And so to have really strong, vibrant community groups organizing on a bunch of different issues, something that I always celebrate, and I'm always glad to see groups coming together, because it's very hard with all of the complexities of day-to-day life and all the complexities about a lot of the issues that we're talking about here. It's very hard to mobilize communities and to move forward some of these really important conversations unless you have people on the ground who are invested in these conversations and make it kind of like a personal mission for them, because then they help you have these conversations with a much larger community and at a much larger level. So I think it's incredibly important. You know, we have, aside from Uprose, which is in Sunset Park right outside of my district, we have a group in Bay Ridge called the Bay Ridge Environmental Group that has really started to take a look at these issues. We actually co-authored an op-ed earlier this year talking about the need for to fully fund the CLCPA with the CCIA, which is the Community Climate Investment Act. And so to be able to have that type of organic grassroots leadership who care about these issues helps make my job a lot easier. And even where they might need to push me a little bit, sometimes you need that push, right? It's like the old, I believe it was that FDR axiom, or you've convinced me, now make me do it, type of thing. So I'm always glad to see groups like that come forward, regardless of the issue that they're organizing around.
Samantha, you talked about, I've known Elizabeth for years. When I was a reporter, right? She was many years ago. She was at this. Are there other groups that you see working in this area? I mean, how much, for instance, in Queens, where you've done some work, is there community pressure forcing city officials to react?
Yeah, I think everywhere there is. Some of them are more organized than others, or maybe more visible, or have sort of a more funded apparatus behind them. But yeah, it's everywhere. I mean, there's environmental justice.
I live on the Upper West Side now, and WEAC and Peggy Shepard, people like that, have been at this for years. Basically, I believe, fighting the sewage treatment plant, the water treatment plant that's up on Riverside, what's now Riverbank State Park. But they've been fighting the degree to which environmental degradation is in fact an equity issue, because everything from bus garages to other environmental factors disproportionately affect poorer communities of color. So Bill, you talked about that, how this, equity plays across a whole range of issues.
Yeah, and I think, to Samantha's point and Andrew's point as well, I mean, I think you could almost go to any community. I've done some of this work in and around Jamaica Bay and in other parts of the city in New Jersey. I mean, there's really, there's some groups that have just emerged focused solely on questions of climate change. I mean, you have like Resilient Red Hook as an example, or other things like that. But then there are others that, have had, long-term presence in communities and have sort of, moved into that space. I think one of the underlying questions that I see a lot in these communities is and this is very simple stuff. I mean, a clear concern about quality of life and a recognition, while that climate is an issue, that there are a range of other questions that communities have about, like, their daily life and jobs and sort of education and safety, et cetera. And I think what they're starting to see now is, like, how do we connect some incentives for climate action and some of these initiatives like, green roofs, et cetera, and really tie it to some of these long-term, questions in communities, equity issues in terms of services, education, employment, et cetera. And I think that's where the winning opportunity is going to be. There is some pushback in many of these communities because of fear of gentrification, right? The city has brought in new initiatives and they see it just sort of spikes interest in redevelopment. So I think to do it well, it's got to be connected to these deep running concerns in communities.
Gentrification is the ultimate, we've done a number of housing issues. Gentrification improves housing stock and also pushes out long-term residents. Equity drives north-south, globally north-south, in what they've been doing in Sunset Park. It's a very complicated issue, and we're going. Have about 15 seconds, so I'm gonna try to run off the 15 seconds right now. I want to thank you all for being here. I think this issue is. I have a 24 and a 23-year-old. This issue is going to be a lot more important to them than it is to me. I've made it this far. The students in the audience, the people that Bill teaches, the people that Cliff teaches. I want to thank you all, and we will see you next time. This is an issue that's not going away. We'll see you all next time on the CUNY Forum. Thank you.